planning to meet an investor's specific needs. Learn more at schwab.com/plan.
This is 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. It's 12:06. Time for KUOW's Week in Review.
Yes, this is where we sort the week's news. I'm Ross Reynolds in for Bill Radke, coming to you live from downtown Ballard with an all-star cast. Karen Weiss is the New York Times Seattle tech correspondent. Karen, where are you today?
Here in Finney, or Seattle.
In the city. And Paul Kiefer is police accountability reporter with Publicola. Paul, where are you coming from?
A basement apartment next to a upholstery place in an abandoned lot.
Okay, we can picture that. And KUOW reporter Esme Jimenez also on our panel. Where are you today, Esme?
Today I'm in the Central District.
You don't have to just hear what we're talking about. You can also see us. We're live streaming on Facebook and YouTube. Just search for KUOW Public Radio on either site. Welcome to the show today. I spent a couple hours downtown this week, and depending on which store you went to, there was either a mandatory mask policy for everyone or a voluntary mask policy if you were vaccinated. A hotel I visited announced they were changing their policy from mandatory to voluntary the next day. We're in this very odd in-between period as the policy at different locations varies from day to day. Walking on the streets, most people are unmasked following CDC guidelines. Others are masked. I'm finding the social cues confusing, and I'm wondering about the three of you.
I think you're absolutely right. It's super awkward because you have your mask on, but it's on your wrist and you're like, what are you guys doing? Do you feel comfortable? You're vaccinated. And people, for the most part, have just been like, well, whatever you want to do. And then I'm like, oh, okay.
Paul, how about you?
My brother just came up from New Orleans about a week ago, and there it's a serious faux pas to wear a mask outside. So he was walking around saying it's really weird to see people washing their car with their mask on. So maybe I've absorbed a little bit of that. I would feel strange wearing it outside. When I'm walking around inside, I've sort of lost all my masks. So now I'm down to one that's pizza themed. I probably have it right here. And then the first mask I had at the beginning of the pandemic, which was the one I wore on the plane up from college when we all got evacuated at the beginning of the pandemic. So I guess there's gonna, I'll hold on to these for nostalgia, I guess. But my options for masks when I'm indoors are now pretty limited.
And Karen, how about you? How are you kind of interpreting the social messages we're getting about wearing masks or not based on what people around you are doing?
Yeah, I mean, it's obvious. I think before I go into any store, it's always is this one where I'm supposed to wear it still or not? But mostly I have a kid who's too young to be vaccinated. So I have this odd thing where I always have him masked inside. If not that we take him in that many stores, but I try to wear it when I'm inside with him places just as a signal that he's not alone on it. But hopefully home stretch on kids, little kids getting vaccinated here. We'll see. Any day. I'll take that announcement any day.
It'll certainly be different a week from now and 2 weeks from now as everything kind of changes around.
Yeah.
Well, on to the more serious news. This week, the Seattle Office of Police Accountability released the results of an investigation into 6 Seattle police officers who were present at the January 6th insurrection that attempted to overturn the presidential election. The investigation found that 2 Seattle officers violated DC law and Seattle police policy when they stood next to the US Capitol in a clearly prohibited area. A photo pulled from the video shows the officers smiling while in close proximity to the Capitol as rioters lined the steps, climbed the walls and scaffolding. OPA Director Andrew Myberg told King 5 that was enough to make their decision.
From that piece of evidence, we were able to, I think, pretty definitively say from our perspective that as a law enforcement officer, you knew or should have known that you were trespassing at the time.
That is the smoking gun.
He also said, quote, that they were direct witnesses to people defiling the seat of the American democracy and assaulting fellow law enforcement officers and did nothing, which makes this all the more egregious, end quote. Well, the Office of Police Accountability does want those officers fired. Paul Kiefer, what happens next?
So Chief Diaz will have the final say in whether the officers get fired. And my guess is, given sort of the public pressure on him to terminate just these 2 officers who are not only facing, the misconduct finding for violating federal law and SPD policy, but also potentially additional investigations for dishonesty during the OPA investigation. In all likelihood, he's going to fire them because, he's already sort of made it a policy of his office to fire people for dishonesty. So if those investigations happen, then either the officers would wind up being unable to testify in court as police officers, or they would get fired, which is the more likely option. But then, what else happens next? There's pressure on, at this point it's sort of moot, but there's pressure on the OPA to sort of, admit wrongdoing, at least from some people in power on the issue of the scope of the investigation, because there were a lot of voices, including, for instance, Councilmember Lisa Herbold, who thought that the OPA should have given more consideration to the possibility that the officers who went to DC knew that there were plans to attack the Capitol, and therefore, violated the department's professionalism policies by knowingly going to join a rally that, in which other people attending the rally had plans to attack the Capitol. But, at this point, it would constitute double jeopardy to reinvestigate any of the officers who went to DC on the ground, for violating professionalism policies. So at this point, they're pretty scot-free. The two officers, Caitlin Rochelle and Alexander Everett, I think almost certainly, Diaz will almost certainly decide to terminate them.
Is it noteworthy that the recommendation that those two officers be fired came not just from the director of the Office of Police Accountability, but also from police officers in the chain of command?
Oh, absolutely. And, it's also worth noting that this whole investigation began when an officer reported their coworkers for attending the rally, or reported a photo of them attending the rally. There are a sizable number of officers within SPD who are uncomfortable with the fact that their coworkers attended the rally. And, for instance, there's one police officer on the Community Police Commission. His name is Mark Mullins. And during a meeting in January, he said that knowing that there were officers who attended the rally made him kind of uncomfortable about the possibility that they are the people who provide him backup during, while making an arrest. There are serious concerns within the department itself about sort of extremism within the ranks. So I don't think it's actually that surprising that the chain of command recommended termination. Plus, it would do favors to the department's struggling public image. So yeah.
Well, is this going to stick? We find in cases like this, often the police union is able to exert a lot of influence based on the collective bargaining agreement and reverse decisions if it should come to the decision of the two officers being fired.
The likelihood of this one, of an arbitrator overturning this decision, is pretty slim because, for all intents and purposes, this was like basically parallel to a criminal investigation. The Capitol Police aren't going to be trying to, bring charges against Alexander Everett and Caitlin Rochelle because they're stretched thin, but there's a clear violation of federal law, and an arbitrator would be really unlikely to say that isn't a policy violation meriting an overturning of the termination. But what SPOG is trying to do, the Seattle Police Officers Guild is trying to do is prohibit the OPA from ordering officers to, they're trying to, get the OPA to admit wrongdoing for ordering officers to turn over personal records like text messages and receipts during this investigation. And they would, hopefully be able to prevent OPA from making similar orders in the future, hopefully for them. If they succeed in that effort, which is also something that has to go to arbitration, then at least temporarily the OPA is pretty limited in what it can do as investigators when it comes to kind of problematic off-duty conduct. But then that whole issue might be resolved if the city can restore the OPA's subpoena power over SPOG in the next contract.
Karen and Esme, what are your thoughts on this story? The two officers being fired, findings about the other officers being indeterminate or saying that they just were participating in a demonstration and that's their free speech rights. What do you think about the story? Esme?
I'm curious about the actual work culture that Paul kind of referenced, in the sense of how will the department actually be in terms of trusting each other. Both the fact that one officer actually gave that information that they saw a photo with another officer who was attending the rallies, to now feeling comfortable calling on some of those people to then support you as backup. So that's where I'm curious to see how the department deals with the actual, cultural changes there.
Sure. Karen, what do you think about this story?
I'm just fascinated by how much evidence, I think the Capitol has been described as the largest crime scene in American history or something like that. And I think all the digital forensics is very fascinating. And I can see why the issue over the subpoena power and whatnot in OPA investigations is contentious and will come up in negotiations and whatnot, because more and more we have tracking devices on our phone and take photos and post things and all of that. So digital evidence is pretty powerful and pervasive. So I can see why this will be like a contentious issue. And there's this question about like, is this a good way? Should there be setting precedent? And obviously the two sides have different opinions about whether or not this is a good precedent to set or not, essentially.
In other police news, a group of University of Washington students and professors want the University of Washington police force disbanded. Paul Kiefer, what's their case here?
So their case is that, technically, well, first of all, there was this New York Times reporting from another local New York Times reporter, Mike Baker, last month about a lawsuit filed by 5 Black officers from the UW Police Department, alleging just the kind of horrific racist abuse by their coworkers and supervisors in the department, which, spurred a coalition of students and faculty who have already been pushing for changes to the police department to, escalate their demands to, call for the department to be disbanded, because they say the presence of officers who and supervisors who, made the kind of remarks or, alleged in the lawsuit means that Black students and other students of color on campus aren't safe with those, officers present. The other case that they're making is that the campus is already under SPD's jurisdiction.
Right.
And so functionally, they say there isn't really a need to have a second police department on campus, because you could transfer the duties of, some of the less law enforcement-y duties of the UW Police Department, like escorting drunk students across campus, or taking reports on stolen bikes to civilians or to an online reporting tool. And then you could have SPD handle more serious criminal investigations like assaults. So that's their real case here.
Yeah, it's really interesting. We've got this about the UW police. There's also been a petition of UW faculty and students asking the university to sever relations with the Seattle Police Department. So much more to occur on this. You're listening to Week in Review, where we sort the week's news. I'm Bill Radke. Karen Weiss, New York Times tech correspondent, is with us, as is Paul Kiefer, police accountability reporter with Publicola, and KUOW reporter Esme Jimenez. Will return in just a moment.
I'm James Kamarasamy, host of BBC NewsHour. Coming up today, we focus on Russian diplomacy as the Taliban makes more gains in Afghanistan and the UN Security Council votes to extend allowing aid to enter rebel-held parts of Syria from Turkey.
BBC NewsHour this afternoon at 1 o'clock.
Support for KUOW comes from Puget Sound Energy, committed to helping families affected by COVID-19 get through difficult times. Details and more information about PSE's programs for assisting in-need customers at pse.com.
72 degrees in Seattle. The forecast is for a sunny afternoon with a high of 79. In fact, we're looking at sunny, warm days for the next several days, with daytime temperatures reaching right around 80. 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. It's 12:20, and it's KUOW's Week in Review.
80 degrees. That's just balmy and nice. I'm Ross Reynolds, in for Bill Radke. Our guests today on Week in Review: Karen Weiss, New York Times Seattle tech correspondent; Paul Kiefer, police accountability reporter with Publicola; and KUOW's own Esme Jimenez. We are looking at that record heat wave in the rearview mirror, but the human toll keeps on rising. Esme, you've been working on a KUOW reporting project to track the deaths. What have you learned?
Yeah, it's incredibly horrifying to start seeing the numbers continue to rise. I think the last count was 99 of suspected or confirmed deaths during this heat wave in Washington. That is bizarre to me that it's this high, and that people, that medical examiners are saying, it'll still keep going up, and we're worried about having to do the welfare checks, a week from now, and finding bodies weeks later. That to me is incredibly heartbreaking. And I've been thinking a lot about too, how some of these people died, whether they didn't have air conditioning, whether they were homeless, whether or not they had somebody check in on them to try to take them to a cooling center. Some of them are as young as I think 39, and some of them are 99. So to me, there's just a number of things that this says. One, that the state maybe isn't actually prepared to handle this kind of thing. And that two, when you really break it down, every county is going to have to kind of come up with its own plan to actually get its constituents safe if they don't have air conditioning. So yeah, I've been thinking on a number of things of that, but that one specifically, I think we haven't quite grasped how bad it really hit the Northwest.
Well, tell us more about who died. Are there any generalities about the folks who were most hit by this?
Yeah, well, right now some medical examiners are not releasing information about first and last names. We just know, it was a 79-year-old in Puyallup, or likewise, they didn't have air conditioning. There was one man who died outside of a church who they believed was homeless. These are the kind of cases that I'm like, it's important for reporters to kind of follow up on that, to be able to actually pull apart the threads. One of the things that I even think about is some of them will have underlying health conditions, right? And so we'll say they're suspected. But I think if something like climate change or heat waves is going to impact people's health that way, then that's something we also need to be thinking about.
Well, this also seems to connect to, in some ways, to the larger issue of the vulnerability of older people living alone, or just people without social connections.
Yeah, and especially with COVID, right? The fact that some of these folks have been living in their homes alone for the past year, or with limited contact, to then be stuck at home without air conditioning. Or I had, in one case, I was just talking to a public records officer, and she just pointed out like, hey, my air conditioning went out. When I called, they were like, well, we're swamped right now. Also, we think it'll easily be $3,000 to $4,000 to fix their air conditioning. And that was a lot for her. She was in Benton County, and she, called her daughter, who had to post on Facebook, hey, can someone come help my mom with her air conditioning? And then that's how someone was able to actually go and help them get it fixed. Otherwise, the public records officer was considering to go get a hotel just to stay cool enough.
Yeah. Has anybody given any thought to what we can do right now to prevent these kind of deaths next time? Clearly, the whole state's not going to become air conditioned overnight. So there's some limitations to it, but short of a giant change like that, what are people talking about that's done elsewhere that we could be doing, Esme?
I think the smallest things that I've seen have been doing like community networks, like a phone tree. So essentially the idea, like if I know Paul and Karen, right, I call them to say like, hey, are you guys okay? Did you end up needing a ride? Are your friends okay? And kind of checking in with each other in this informal setting. Of course, this doesn't necessarily work everywhere, and you don't know who you're missing out on. So I think at the county levels, or when you go up in terms of governments and what they can do, that's where it gets a little bit tricky.
Yeah. Paul, you've been looking at the heat wave's impact on prison populations, and I don't imagine many prisons are air conditioned, are they?
Well, only on the east side of the state, because temperatures have been historically higher there. On the west side of the state, where there are 9 prisons, which is most of the prisons in the Washington Department of Corrections system, there is only air conditioning in a handful of units. So for instance, up in Monroe, there's only air conditioning in the unit that houses people with severe mental or behavioral disorders. For the most part, in the larger units, the cooling systems are things like a duct that moves air in from the outside and then some overhead fans. So during the heat wave, temperatures in some of the upper floors in the cells got above 110, according to the people who were incarcerated at this unit in Monroe called the Twin Rivers unit, who I spoke to. So the issue that we're looking at, the DOC is currently scrambling to figure out what to do as heat waves inevitably become more common on the west side of the state. But what they pulled off during this last heat wave was, things like they had cooling centers in dining halls where people could go briefly. They had these things called misting stations that are basically sprinklers under tents in the prison yard where people could briefly stand to cool off during their rec time, which was incidentally during the hottest part of the day. They were outside, and they made some changes to rules so people could wear, t-shirts and shorts outside, but there were other things that fell through. So they didn't manage to turn down the temperatures in the showers. So a lot of people just skipped showering. That wasn't an option to cool down during the heat wave.
They had to get into a shower and take a hot shower in 110-degree temperatures.
Most of them decided just not to take showers. Yeah. So there is a lot of preparations that need to be done to make sure that, thankfully no one died during this last heat wave. 2 people were hospitalized, but there's a lot to be done to make sure that our prison population, and particularly the growing number of older people in Washington's prison population, are safe and healthy during the next heat wave. And that might require capital improvements, but I'm still waiting on the DOC to tell me more about whether there are capital improvements coming down the line for Western Washington prisons.
Sure. These deaths are just horrifying. And if things go as they are, we're apt to see these high temperatures again. And sadly, more deaths. Karen, as you kind of looked over this news, any takeaways from the heat wave and how we've dealt with it and not dealt with it?
Well, I just keep thinking forward to the fire season. And, one of the things that I feel like historically we've been able to do is the evenings do get cool in Seattle and the region broadly. And so it's kind of your chance to catch up. Some colleagues had done reporting that came out about how nights are just not cooling off in the same way they used to. That's one of the changes in the patterns. And so, you don't get that catch up. And in fire season, that was one of the challenges, right? You couldn't open your windows at night to get the fresh air in. And so I think you have the compounding effects. And I know there's also questions about how this will intersect with labor law. And, Oregon has instituted some temporary state OSHA standards for farm workers. Washington may, I believe, today, I think I had read in the Seattle Times. So, but they're clearly temporary ones trying to just get through this heat this summer. But you have to ask if there's, long-term, and Oregon has already said they expect long-term changes to come about how do you protect workers in extreme heat, and as opposed to having, recommended temperatures at which people stop working, potentially more mandates. My colleagues reported today that there was a worker at a Walmart facility in Oregon essentially fainted in the parking lot and later on died at a hospital. So people are working in the heat of the day, which can be a large part of the day, as we saw in this last heat wave. Then it seems like there needs to be more regulation around that.
Our reporter, John Ryan, has been reminding us that it's a mistake to call this an accident. It's global warming caused by humans that's bringing on these extreme heat events that we have not seen the last of. It's the Week in Review. I'm Ross Reynolds in for Bill Radke with Karen Weiss, New York Times Seattle Tech correspondent, Paul Kiefer, police accountability reporter from Publicola, and KUOW reporter Esme Jimenez. Back in a moment.
Karen, I just have to say to your point, that's so interesting to me that I've been thinking about. I had talked to a union organizer who works with farm workers, and he was saying a lot of the people that come from Central Valley come up north to try to escape those hot temperatures. But now that I'm thinking about it, I'm like, so you had California be the first to institute, right?
Review. I'm Ross Reynolds with my guests, KUOW reporter Esme Jimenez, Paul Kiefer from Publicola, and Karen Weiss from the New York Times. There's a new report out from Oregon Public Broadcasting that has found that the sheriff's office in Clark County, Washington, has continuously shared inmates' personal information with ICE. Now, that might sound as though that would be normal, but some are arguing that this close contact is illegal. Esme, could you explain why this contact is such a big deal? One might think that, well, if someone's in jail, sharing their information with another agency of the federal government that enforces laws can't be a big deal. Why is it?
Definitely a big deal. There was a specific law that Washington passed called Keep Washington Working a couple of years ago that specifically prohibits local law enforcement officers from sharing information. Any information that's not deemed publicly available to the rest of us, they can't share that information with ICE officials. And specifically in the OPB article, the thing that I thought was astounding was they were pulling records requests, right, and finding that some of these officials were saying go get this guy. And that a lot of the times they were kind of profiling people based on their last name. If it sounded Spanish, they were able to pull some of the stuff. And I mean, that's illegal. The Attorney General's office has been involved before in previous cases when it comes to, for example, ICE trying to stop people when they're coming to courthouses just to pay a parking ticket or just to do something that has to do with the court. There's been reporting on that as well. So this specific story to me really blew my mind.
Well, if officials in Clark County, Washington are violating state law, is there any move to act on that?
Mm-hmm. I don't know yet. I assume the Washington Attorney General's office will get involved at some point. I know that I've talked to the University of Washington Center for Human Rights, and they've been cataloging similar situations. I can also tell you that in filing some records requests last year during COVID, I realized that one of the first COVID cases that actually came to the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma was through a jail transfer. So somebody was picked up in Kittitas County. They tested positive once they were actually moved then into the detention center in Tacoma.
There's some kind of shocking cases here. ICE already in hot water in the Seattle area. Just last month, a complaint filed on behalf of Carlos Rios, a U.S. citizen detained for a week by ICE in Tacoma he had his U.S. passport on him. How did that happen, Esme?
That's a great question, and I would love ICE to let me know about that. What we know, though, based on the court records, is that yes, this Carlos Rios was driving. He was stopped for a DUI. At some point, some information has to have been released such that ICE was able to pick him up. I called the Washington State Patrol and I called Pierce County office as well to find out, hey, what gives? How did this information come out? And at least with the public information officer that I spoke to, he said, it's not something that we do. We know that it's against the rules. We know there's Keep Washington Working Act that prohibits us to actually share that information. So I don't know how it is that ICE found out about this.
That's so crazy. He had his passport. Here's my passport. Why are you taking me in?
Yeah.
I mean, ICE is a federal agency, and so there may be some repercussions here for violations of state law. Are we finding any changes in ICE's policy or how they carry out their job since the new administration has come in? Or is it basically the same as it ever was?
No, certainly. I've been hearing from officials at different levels saying that no, based on the new administration, we have different priorities. So now we really are specifically trying to target high-level criminals, anybody that's deemed a public safety threat, that kind of thing. I think, unfortunately, though, when it comes to trickling down federal policy into local levels, that's where we kind of see missteps or individuals being able to actually change that, which means, calling ICE if they had those relationships previously and saying, you can come pick up this person. I think they're undocumented.
The case involves Clark County, but what about other relationships between local jurisdictions and ICE? Are we seeing too much coziness elsewhere that we know of?
I believe we will. I know the UW Center for Human Rights is due to release a report actually going through a number of counties that have had contact with ICE, despite it being illegal in the state.
Before we move on, Paul, Karen, any thoughts on these policies that are currently not being followed by the federal agency enforcing our laws?
Well, one of the things that's on my mind is actually the enforcement of, so after the Blake decision, which, and then the state legislature's response to the Blake decision, which
Explain what the Blake decision is for people.
Of course, yeah. So earlier this year, the Washington State Supreme Court, effectively ruled that all of Washington's drug possession laws or drug possession statutes were unconstitutional, which then means that people who were previously sentenced or on parole for drug violations or for drug possession are going to be resentenced or have or they will be removed from parole, or they will be reimbursed for their legal financial obligations, which are court fees that you pay. But the legislature then passed a law that now makes drug possession a misdemeanor. Personal amounts of drug, if you have what's called the personal quantity or a personal amount or personal use amount of a controlled substance. And theoretically, prosecutors will be able to, will have to refer people to treatment options the first 2 times they get arrested for drug possession. On the 3rd time, they have the option to charge with a misdemeanor. Now, what this means for ICE is that misdemeanor drug possession is still a deportable offense. And so theoretically, under the Biden administration's policy, that's not something that ICE would be arresting people for or pursuing deportation for. But we'll have to see if in some smaller counties in the state, prosecutors begin charging people with misdemeanor drug possession and deportations for drug possession continue. Because to some degree, this will also be dependent on the cooperation of local prosecutors, on the kind of with the state legislature's goal of getting more people who are arrested for drug possession into treatment for substance abuse. So that's what I'm thinking about.
Yeah. Hey, Karen Weiss, any thoughts on this before we move on?
I don't. I think it's, obviously interesting clashes between federal and state law, but I don't have anything more.
We're very law enforcement heavy on this program today. Another one that's come up this week. Last Friday, Washington's Offices of Correction Ombuds released a final recommendations. They did a 2-year-long review of the state's work release program. Paul, let's take a step back. What is the work release program?
So when you are up for what's called an earned release in Washington Department of Corrections, within 12 to 6 months of your release, depending on kind of the DOC and on your behavior record in prison, you're eligible to go to something called a work release center, which is a place where you live that is, for instance, there's one in North Beacon Hill, there's one on Capitol Hill, and there's one in Pioneer Square, where it's a residential facility, but during the day you can go out to a civilian job like construction, or you can go to visit your family. It's supposed to be kind of part of the continuum between life in prison and civilian life.
And this year-long review found problems.
Right. There have been for a long time, complaints for years about staff at work release centers being either unnecessarily punitive when residents violated small policies like, returning late because their bus didn't arrive on time, their bus home from work didn't arrive on time, or retaliating against residents for complaining about work release staff. So there was one case in Spokane where a resident said that a work release guard groped her, and when she tried to bring a complaint against the guard, she was sent back to prison allegedly for threatening that guard. The Office of Corrections Ombuds said that that threat, the supposed threat, was hearsay. There was an incident in Seattle where residents at the work release, a resident at the work release center in Beacon Hill gave a presentation that was critical of the work release program at Seattle Central College, and then was subsequently sent back to prison, apparently in retaliation for that presentation. So this pattern of retaliation or kind of overly punitive tactics by work release staff drew the concern of the Office of Corrections Ombuds, which led up to this work group that wound up being about a whole lot more than just retaliation. It really became a work group to discuss how the DOC could broadly reform the work release program. So it snowballed significantly over the past roughly year and a half. So
they determined there's some problems here. What are the recommendations for fixing those problems?
The recommendations were pretty broad. So like, for instance, they asked the DOC to begin training staff to factor people's mental health conditions into the sanctions they issue for policy violations. They asked the DOC to come up with a broader array of sanctions for policy violations that can kind of scale up to sending someone back to prison, but that start with something much less severe. And then there are other things, like they asked the DOC to begin allowing residents in work release facilities all across the state to have access to personal cars, so that there's less of a risk that they make it home from work late. And then there are things like, training work release staff on what retaliation looks like and how to avoid it. That's sort of the scope was pretty wide when it comes to recommendations for changes.
So lots of recommendations, and how do we know that the recommendations will be followed?
Well, that's tricky. So the Office of Correctional Ombuds is new, and it's existed for the past 3-4 years, and the DOC is still sort of getting used to oversight. The Office of Correctional Ombuds recommended some measurements for changes to or for improvements in the work release program, things like surveying how many former work release residents were holding a job or enrolled in an education program 6 months after their release. And the DOC didn't entirely agree to kind of use all the metrics that the Office of Correctional Ombuds recommended. So that instead, the DOC says they're working on an exit interview or an exit survey for people leaving work release to kind of determine whether conditions have improved. But really advocates, both people who've been in work release and their families, are still wary of trusting the DOC to fully commit to the reforms that they agreed to during the work group, because that relationship has been frayed for so long that I don't think anyone has fully developed confidence in the DOC's willingness to follow up. So, and the Office of Corrections Ombuds can't force the DOC to follow up on the promises they've made. So it's A, it'll be hard to track, and B, it's going to be a test of the strength of the relationship between the OCO and the DOC.
To your knowledge, has this risen to the level of a political issue? Are there any lawmakers who are seizing onto this report for stronger measures?
There's going to be more. I mean, the OCO is working pretty hard to promote this, the results of this work group. So, we haven't seen, I haven't been, become aware of any things within the legislature to start scrutinizing the work release program more carefully. If anything, I think the subject that the legislature might latch onto as a point of discussion is accountability for work release staff who allegedly participated in retaliation. But that remains to be seen because it's such a new report, and there weren't any legislators on the work group. So.
Okay, there might be more fallout from that. You're listening to the Week in Review. I'm Ross Reynolds with my guests. You hear from Paul Kiefer, police accountability reporter with Publicola. Also with us, KUOW reporter Esme Jimenez and Karen Weiss from the New York Times. She's the Seattle tech correspondent. We're going to hear from her in a moment. Some big news about departures and the status of those those fulfillment centers. This is the record on. This is Week in Review on KUOW.
Oh, who is this?
This is Huey. He's a very good boy, but he is very needy. Hi, Huey. Don't say anything while you're here, okay?
Support for KUOW comes from Taco Time, family owned with a focus on locally sourced ingredients and compostable packaging. With 79 locations around the Puget Sound, online ordering is available at tacotimenw.com and on the Taco Time Northwest app.
The night sky in a corner of West Texas is so dark that you can sometimes see the Milky Way, but
we have seen a gradually increasing glow that simply wasn't there in prior years.
Oil drilling. I'm Kai Rizdal. Astronomers versus the oil fields next time on Marketplace.
Today at 2:30 and 6:30 p.m. on 94.9 KUOW, Seattle's NPR news station. 73 degrees and sunny in Seattle. Forecast says we'll get up to 79 this afternoon. It's 12:43, and this is KUOW's Week in Review.
And I'm Ross Reynolds in for Bill Radke. My guests, KUOW's Esme Jimenez, Publicola's Paul Kiefer, and Karen Weiss from the New York Times. And you don't have to just hear what we're saying. You can also see our vivid expressions if you tune in on live streaming on Facebook or YouTube. Just search for KUOW Radio at either site. Well, Jeff Bezos has left the top job at Amazon just as his personal fortune peaks. He's headed to space. Meanwhile, there are lots of other top execs at Amazon who are also leaving. Karen, you've been on this story. Give us an idea of why this matters. Do we have any idea what these high-level departures could mean for the future of Amazon?
Yeah, it's this very interesting inflection point for the company right now. Jeff Bezos founded it, was CEO until this week, and he handed the reins over to Andy Jassy. So it's a kind of a momentous moment of change, and that a lot of Amazon had a very stable leadership team for a very long time, and now you see a lot of VPs departing, and it's many of whom were there. I mean, some since I talked to some, left after starting in 1999 at the company, and so it's just a moment of change. Amazon has worked hard to have kind of these principles for leadership that kind of try to create stability, but they are losing a lot of institutional memory and institutional knowledge. And some of it is a recognition or acknowledgement of it just being a really different place in terms of its size and scale. When you look at some of the new hires it's brought in, there are people who ran really large businesses, people who were senior at GM or Boeing, things like that. So it's there's this kind of endless debate at Amazon about how to stay day one and have the startup mentality, but it also employs 1.3 million people. It's not a startup. I mean, quite obviously not. So there's a lot of, some people are retiring, some people are taking top level jobs at public companies. They knew that if they wanted to really be the boss at something, they had to leave. They could run a big business at Amazon, but to be the boss, that is, there was limited mobility, and some are going to startups. And part of that reflects that Seattle has a lot more promising startups now than it used to. There weren't that many really hot places to go even 5 years ago. Now there are definitely places where people could feel they could kind of get back to that startup building mode.
Can we glean any themes about what the future might hold for Amazon based on the new people taking these leadership positions, or is it just too soon to tell?
It's interesting that the longevity of the senior team had Jeff Bezos praised. He said it was part of what built Amazon. It was also seen by some people internally as a lid on their own ambition. The team was almost exclusively white and male, and so some of the new hires have not been white and male. And so you can create kind of new paths upward when people have been there for a long time leave, but also there are questions about like, how do you maintain the Amazonianness when you have a lot of kind of new faces internally? And historically, external hires haven't done great there or haven't lasted super long there. It's not across the board, but you do see a lot of people kind of come and go at senior ranks if they're not Amazonian enough. So it's all of this, I think, is this adaptation of Amazon acknowledging that it is this huge company and they have different types of needs and there are different types of employees, and they're balancing kind of the public scrutiny that comes with being large, all these different things that comes with the kind of scale it's achieved now.
Now, financial analysts and financial markets often make harsh judgments about changes in companies. Are there any signs that people are issuing warnings or saying that there could be some positive changes based on this?
Analysts are very bullish on Amazon. They just think there's so much growth that its advantage in e-commerce is so strong, on cloud computing is so strong that it will compound over time. So I believe, I don't follow the actual stock price that closely on a daily basis, but Amazon won a favorable ruling, or they kind of won a fight over a huge government contract that just sent its stock up significantly earlier this week. So when Jeff Bezos announced he was stepping aside as CEO, there was not like a major crash that came with it. I think they see this as like a growth machine that has so many advantages baked in at this point.
I'm just kind of curious, when founders leave, sometimes they don't leave. Howard Schultz came riding back to lead Starbucks after the company stumbled. What's your take on Bezos? Is he that kind of guy?
Well, I think the Microsoft example is probably a better thing, where Bezos is becoming executive chairman in the same way Bill Gates did, and he is. I think you'll see him spending a lot of time on Blue Origin, the space company based down in Kent. He's going to space on their first manned space flight on July 20th, and by all accounts is very, 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 very passionate about space travel since he was a little kid. And so there have been ways in which Blue Origin has lagged behind SpaceX, Elon Musk's company. And so I wouldn't be surprised if you see him spending more energy there. So coming back as CEO, I wouldn't necessarily count on that, though there is a question of like how much power he will exert as executive chairman on the board. But Andy Jassy, who is the new CEO of Amazon, has basically built Amazon alongside Jeff Bezos. I mean, he's been there since it was in startup mode, essentially, and built AWS, the cloud service that, hugely profitable, massive business. Very similar in many ways, not identical, but very similar in many ways. So he's not an unknown quantity. He was not seen as an unknown quantity, and was one of the heirs apparent, essentially.
So these are the high-level Amazon workers. But Karen, you've been doing some great reporting on the turnover among employees at the Amazon fulfillment centers. How large has that been, and has it affected the company's ability to serve customers?
Yeah, I mean, so at Amazon corporate, the average turnover, or the kind of target turnover rate, is 10% a year. In the fulfillment centers, they've been turning over about 150% a year, which is extremely high, higher than the kind of retail and transportation industry broadly. They've created a really mechanized process for hiring people through a computer screen without job interviews. People resign on an app by pushing a button. It's just a huge volume machine serving customer demand. And there are concerns internally in Seattle with executives here really worrying about running out of workers, that this kind of high churn, high burn model is not sustainable.
That's been a problem in the entire economy. We see lots of places struggling to find workers. Has that caught up with Amazon?
Yeah, I mean, you can see it in their response. They are doing large bonuses, sign-on bonuses. You can see signs, in different parts of the region here, but across the country, $1,000 sign-on bonuses. They're doing double pay for overtime right now, refer a friend bonuses, they got rid of drug testing, marijuana testing as a requirement for employment. So you see, yeah. So I mean, obviously, a lot of states have changed their policy too, so that you're not allowed to be high on the job, but they're not going to screen for it at employment. So you definitely see them responding with raising wages and whatnot. And so a question is money, essentially raising wages, the main tool they have, or is there or is there more they can do about the nature of the job to make people stay longer? Because when you're constantly replacing people, you're kind of on this hamster wheel then, and it's expensive to hire at this place at that rate. So people leave very early in their tenure. Attrition is very high in the first month or two of people being there. I mean, I've heard stories of people walking in their first day and at lunch not coming back. I mean, it's just and when you're hired without an interview, maybe you don't really know what you're expecting or prepared for the physicality of it.
Well, one of the interesting things I found about your story was that it contrasted the way that Amazon deals with customers, this highly efficient, nuanced system of mechanized things to get that package to you in the proper moment, contrasting with the kind of personnel policies they have for their employees at Amazon fulfillment centers, which is relatively inept.
Yeah, there was a level of just like imprecision or sloppiness. And we had examples in our story of people fired who weren't supposed to be fired. We had an example of a woman who was supposed to be fired, who it wasn't put in the system properly. So she just kept showing up for work and still works at Amazon. And like, when was the last time you got the wrong item in your package? So and internally folks are saying like, why can't we bring the sophistication and ambition that we have with our supply chain and our fulfillment operations to our kind of approach to managing this now really large workforce? I mean, almost basically 1 million employees in the US.
You had this quote from Jeff Bezos to the effect that he didn't want warehouse employees to stick around and get too comfortable. Is that an accurate paraphrase?
Essentially, yeah. He thought that that having a long-term entrenched workforce was like a road to pave the road to mediocrity, essentially. And so you can respond to that in two ways, right? You can say, okay, let's create programs for people to leave, which is what Amazon historically had done. They'll pay for job training to exit. They'll pay you thousands of dollars to leave. Or you could say, okay, another path would have been, let's work on focusing, how do we prevent people becoming unhappy after 3 years? Is they had data that had showed that people were less happy after 3 years. So instead of saying, okay, see ya, I think there's this open question, could you do more just to make it more fulfilling, or have a career path after 3 years for folks who are there to go into management, which is very, very, very hard odds against you to do that.
Well, I got to think that maybe some background to this, the fact that there are some rumblings of unionization at Amazon fulfillment facilities might be somewhere in the background. If your workforce is constantly flipping over, it becomes a lot harder for unions to organize.
Yes, absolutely. And there's no doubt, you talk to organizers, without a doubt, the attrition is a huge, huge issue. And we saw that in Bessemer, Alabama, when there was the unionization fight. The union talked about how many of the names that were on the job roll at the start of the unionization effort were just gone from the company by the time the vote actually came around. But I spoke with the former head of HR for the fulfillment centers, and he said, the goal wasn't that unionization was a sign of problems of how your workforce felt. It wasn't the problem, essentially. So I think if unionization is the sign of problems, and we were seeing that there clearly are problems, because the unionization threat has been larger in the past year than it's ever been at Amazon before.
When a reporter does a great story like this, you get new sources eager to talk. I'm wondering if you and your fellow reporters on the story have been contacted by Amazon employees, and are we apt to see a follow-up to this?
Yeah, we got more than 300 people wrote in pretty specific experiences that we're still, frankly, triaging through all of them. If you're listening, call me, people, write me, email me. I'm especially here in Seattle. I'll take a walk with you. So we are hoping to learn more, and then just really do our best to understand kind of what motivates the people who work at Amazon and the decisions that they made. We tried really hard to figure out the why behind the decisions that Amazon has.
It's the nature of the news that we're talking about bad news, But there's always good news. So I'm curious to hear from the three of you about what made you smile, what made you happy this week.
You call me? Yes. I actually tried this Peruvian chicken place for the first time this week, and it was very good. So that definitely put a smile on my face.
Which one?
The one that's over on like either Rainier or MLK.
Yeah.
Okay.
Right where Rainier starts near the ID. Yeah.
That's the one. Go to it.
Chicken. I'm unaware of its flavor.
It was a big deal. When I was in North Carolina, there was Peruvian grilled chicken as a prominent feature of the local culinary scene. I'm mostly excited that Rainier cherries are in season. I know that they suffered during the heat wave, but the ones that were picked before then are great. So if you can go pick up a bag.
I was at the farmers market here in Ballard last weekend, and the woman who was selling the Rainier cherries, her fingernails were done like a Rainier cherry. It was hilarious.
Beautiful.
And Karen, what's making you happy these days?
Oh, I had my first camping of the season this long weekend. I met up with my sister's family, and we went to Mount Rainier, and it was beautiful. And it worked pretty well. We got a tent that has blackout, is like kind of like a blackout shade tent. And so my son actually slept as opposed to waking up at 5 a.m. with the sunrise. So it was really nice to get outside and see family and enjoy this beautiful state.
I've been seeing lots of stories about how our national parks are just jammed with folks.
Yes.
Was there a crowding problem where you were camping there?
One advantage of small children is you're up early though. So by the time we were leaving the national park, there was a huge line outside the gate. They were metering people coming in for sure. It must have been 200 cars waiting in line at just this one entrance. So I was glad they were limiting the flow into the park because the trails can't handle more than they had. Yeah. But it's definitely a thing for sure.
Well, what made me happy this week was the arrival of my big ass ceiling fans. That's the name of a company that makes you see them in many locations. But the branding of their home variety is the more tranquil haiku fans. I'm going to have them installed by the end of the month for some cool breezes the next time it gets hot. I'm really looking forward to that. Thank you for listening to Week in Review, and thank you so much for our panelists. Karen Weiss, New York Times Seattle tech correspondent, looking for accountability reporter with Public KUOW, KUOW reporter Isma Jimenez. Our program produced by Sarah Leibovitz and Alec Cohen. Social media and live streaming by Juan Pablo Chiquiza. Tea Pocascu is also working on the tech side. Thanks so much for listening. Bill Radke is going to be back next week. I'm Ross Reynolds, wishing you a